Hi everyone, my name is Yu. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Michigan, and I will join Vanderbilt University as an assistant professor soon. In this paper, we will talk about the characteristics and challenges for a unique community, open source software for social good. This work is done with Dr. Dina Ford and Dr. Tom Zimmerman from Microsoft Research. We also got a lot of support from the GitHub social impact sector for the study. Let's think about one question. When we talk about open source like GitHub, what are the projects that come to your mind first? Usually, we'll immediately think of projects like Linux kernel, different libraries, which are technical tools and support for software developers. We refer to those projects as for technical good. However, especially in recent years, it is more and more common to find open source projects that aim to solve societal issues with a social impact. For example, you may find a project on GitHub that helps identify safe restroom access for gender minorities, or a project that supports domestic violence victims, or more recently, projects that support frontline workers during COVID-19. These projects have very different goals compared to the traditional technical good projects. They commonly share to support a greater social good. In 2020, the GitHub social impact sector released a report pointed out that with an increasing impact, we lack resources and research to support the social good community. There are reasons why that happened. First, though we talk about it or have seen it mentioned in areas like AI, there's no unified definition for the term social good, especially for open source or from the view of contributors. Second, we can't find relatively complete resources to locate the social good projects. We don't have much information to understand this community at all. Thus, in this study, we for the first time introduced the notion of open source software for social good, and we want to answer the high-level questions like how to characterize the open source for social good community, how can we support them? To answer the research questions, we use sequential mixed methods in this study. Because we don't know a lot about open source for social good yet, we first conducted semi-structured interviews with contributors that are involved. Then, using the thematic coding analysis results of the interview and also combining with the previous studies on general open source projects, we designed a more detailed online survey and collected responses from contributors. Then, with a qualitative analysis on the interview data and a quantitative analysis on the survey data, we present our conclusions and implications. For the semi-structured interview design, we found 437 open source for social good projects on GitHub from 2 third-party platforms. The first one is Ovio, where 7 self-selected social labels are used to categorize nominated social good projects. The other is called Digital Public Good Alliance. They adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the UN to categorize the projects. In total, we included over 14,000 GitHub contributors, and we recruited 21 participants for the interview. Surprisingly, the social good projects they have worked on covered a wide range of diverse topics, including education equality, civil infrastructure, healthcare, etc. We sent our survey to contributors from both the 437 social good projects as well as the 642 other general open source projects. We emailed 3,000 contributors from each set of projects and got 517 responses from all over the world, including areas with increased participation in recent years like Africa. More demographic information of the respondents can be found in our paper. Going back to the challenges for the study, we don't know how developers define open source for social good. Also, based on some opinions we collected from the interviews, we put 2 special questions in our survey to group the respondents into 4 sets to ask further questions based on their answers. The first question is, do you think all open source projects are for social good? For those who believe the open source for social good is different from general open source projects, we asked them the second question. Have you ever worked on a social good project before? To put it simply here, We can group the respondents based on their open source for social good opinions and experience, and then compare their opinions across groups. Next, while all the details can be found in the paper, I will present some highlighted findings we got from our analysis. We found the majority of our participants believe that in open source, social good projects are very different from general open source projects. They also give their own opinions and metrics on how to define them. With both the interview and the survey results, here we give the definition. We say, open source software for social good are open source software projects where the outcome distinctly targets a community of people to overcome a societal issue. This is the definition we present for the first time to the community. Motivation is a very important factor to sustain participation in open source. In our study, we listed 13 different items for contributors to select. While sharing some in common, we found very interesting and significant difference on motivations between contributing to social good projects and general open source projects. For example, we found that social good contributors significantly care less about benefiting themselves, such as practicing coding or beefing up resumes. They care more about solving societal issues and help others. Here, I want to highlight one quote from a contributor in our study. She said, I think the main reason is because I want to make a difference on my life, make a fingerprint on the world. You may have noticed we use her quote as the title of our paper. We also investigated the factors contributors used to evaluate a project. We found that while sharing common factors of evaluation, such as if you're interested in the issue or if the project is active and welcoming enough, social good contributors significantly care more about the owners of projects. In fact, they care more by over 20% compared to general open source projects. One evaluation factor is the impact of projects. We are wondering, how do contributors evaluate different scales of impact? Similar to what happened to the Spider-Man, when he can only save one, who will he choose? A bus full of strangers? Or someone he personally care more about, like Mary Jane? So we bring up this Mary Jane, Spider-Man, and the trolley problem to the open source contributors. If they only have time for one, how do they choose? On spatial, temporal, and social proximities, we found open source contributors prefer projects with global impact, long-term benefits, or that's directly related to their own connections. Lastly, we investigate the current challenges in open source for social good community. Many emphasize that it is much harder to find a social good project to work on. These many challenges leave a big question for us, for our audience today. How can we help them? First, how can we help match the contributors to the social good projects? As a community, we can help locate the social good projects using labels, badges, or a better self-nomination guideline and mechanism. We can clarify and make the information that the social good project contributors care about more accessible, like the targeted users, the societal issues, as well as the owners' profiles. We need to also protect the safety and the privacy in open source for social good, including protecting our contributors through training to identify risky situations, as well as help our contributors to adapt to special regulations for data privacy issues. The community also needs our help, giving the special characteristics about open source for social good projects on how they can safely and efficiently make their social good projects to open source. For example, can we provide them a model to do so? In summary for this paper, we present the first study to define and investigate a unique community in open source. We call it the open source software for social good. We identify the motivations, the factors of evaluation, and the challenges in this community. We are happy to announce that our study has been highlighted in GitHub October's report, as well as the GitHub Social Impact Sector report. Here, we also want to call for participation in our software engineering research community to help and support open source for social good together. Thank you, everyone. Together.
Why mine shows I'm already live.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the session on open source participants motivation. I'm very happy to have here you, Tom, and Denai, who are the authors of the first paper. So, as you have seen already the video on leaving my fingerprints, motivations and challenges of contributing to open source software for social good. We have now some time for questions. So please, if you want, you can put questions in the chat. In the meantime, I have prepared a couple of them. So have you looked if those developers who participate in open source software for social good are different than the developers that participate in the usual open source software projects?
Yes, actually, all the results we presented to our audience and also the tables we have in our paper, there's always a comparison there. So part of the it's almost like a 50%, 50%. So 50% of our response, they're actually participants in the social good project, and another 50% from we call the technical good projects. So you can see there's also, you can see the comparison between those two groups, and you can also see no matter on the motivation or the way they select the projects to work on, their evaluation factors, there's like a difference and also significant difference between those two groups. So okay. This, just one comment. This and also this groups, like which group you're from, is actually is very first in the survey identified, like by asking them the questions. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So we have got some questions. So the first one by Fabio. He asks, how are you planning to track the projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just looking at the paper, like what we did last summer when we look for those projects are from two third-party platforms. So one is OVO, the other is called the Digital Public Good Alliance. So back then, how the way the third party labeled them, there are like two mainstreams. The first one is they just use the tags they define themselves based on how they understand the social good categories. But for the second mainstream here, which is like a more clearly defined, where they use the 17 SDGs, the Sustainability Development Goals defined by the UN, the United Nations. Yeah. So that's the two things that's currently happening. In the future, right now, I think Digital Public Good Reliance, they're also working on like a second version of a more well-defined procedure to label those projects. So far, I believe the 17 SDGs are still used, but that can lead to like an interesting discussion within our community, especially for open source projects. How should we tag the projects? Yeah, that's also something we want to bring up the discussion with our audience. For example, in GitHub, what kind of tags we should use, like what kind of badges we should use to make it easier for our developers to locate the projects.
Okay, fantastic. So Bram wonders how these projects, and he says especially those who involve less coding, have adopted the common GitHub best practices like code review, continuous integration, etc.
I see. So so basically from our results from the survey and the interviews, what we found is in the general experience on coding, like those technical steps, like a coding, code review, CI, as our audience mentioned, in general, their experience are kind of identical if we're only talking about the technical parts. However, because we already presented that the background of our teammates in those social good projects can be much more diversified, and also the age, the distribution, the interest, the motivation they have, which makes the motivation behind those operations are different. So I would say, so I guess in summary here, I would say for social good projects on the technical part, there's like nothing like a worse compared to general open source, like a very identical, just think about yourself as like a very a common software developer. But indeed, because of the social impact factors there, those like motivations, the way they think about, they select problem projects are different. So hopefully that's
I have a follow-up question in this regard. Oh, I got some echo now. So there are some things that that open source projects for social good have special, like privacy and so on, which you have talked in your paper, and these are not really addressed in GitHub. Or no, how would you think an infrastructure to address those things that are missing?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's also one of the greatest challenges we found out during our interviews and our survey. So we did some like discussions with our participants and also those practitioners in the social GitHub social good impact sectors, as well as those people who are actually working on those projects that combine open source community and social good motivations there. So some ideas here. So first, what we're thinking about is, because some social good project, they can contain sensitive like topics there, and based on your physical locations, that can definitely introduce like potential risky situations to our developers and also users. So what can we do? For example, in GitHub, for those special projects, if there is certain procedural of training or policies that we can present to our developers to make them first, they are like they are more clear about certain risky situations in advance, so they know how to protect themselves, like for example their own information. So the other thing is, when we work on those projects on the data part, what are those like policies that we should apply to the project development phase to protect the information for our users? So that's like two big things here. And Dina and Tom, if you have anything to add here, feel free to jump in.
Yes, I'll just add a couple of things. There's been an ongoing conversation recently about what does this look like. So for those who may not have been or may not be as familiar with kind of past GitHub organizations, they were things like the community and safety team, which kind of transitioned into emph. And what they were kind of charged with doing is creating different reporting and safety mechanisms embedded in GitHub. Over time, the team kind of started working on additional projects, new contributors as well. So they were looking at safety and privacy before, but this ongoing conversation is starting to happen more and more as we talk about the impact of the projects people are working on, the high risk factor of them. So I think that's a great question you asked, Gregorio, because it's resurging even within Microsoft as well about what does that look like? How do we think about it sustainably as we try to connect more sub-communities together, like strangers together? How do we do that in a safe way? So great question.
Okay, thank you. We have several more questions. Sridhar asks two of them. So he asks first, did you focus on GitHub projects with SDGs? I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals, I guess is SDG.
So when we work on those this project, all of the participants we recruit are indeed from GitHub projects. But when we select the projects, we didn't really specify like what labels they are, because that's one of the research goal of this paper. We want to know what kind of label people are currently using to identify those projects. So for the first question, the answer is kind of yes and no. So for the second question, did you find that contributor specific? Yes, that's a great question. Actually, in our survey, I think it's in our paper, but may not be in the presentation, we actually checked like what kind of social good projects are more popular. It turned out that the top popular projects are healthcare, yeah, they mentioned here, and also education, and also civil infrastructure. Yeah, I think it's more details in the paper. Yep.
Okay, nice. So Suhaib has another question. He's asking about support from the big tech companies. And if you think if recruiting support from such companies can have an effect on social good projects.
That is also a great question. So so actually when we were recruiting the participants, we realized, especially for younger population, a lot of them, they started contributing to those social good projects because of some advertisement of certain projects from big tech companies, which is Google, Microsoft, things like that. So yes, indeed, we believe support from big tech companies can definitely have a great impact. But speaking of big tech companies, when we ask people how they see, because the majority of the contributors from social good projects, they talked about, they care about the owner profiles of those projects. So here we want our community to realize that this opinion here is a kind of bipolar. So some people, they really